It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Hank LaRocco. Hank has spent over 30 years in the industrial MRO and safety identification fields. His robust experience with lockout-tagout includes hundreds of training sessions, performance of many violation appeasement assessments, and lockout device engineering studies and usage assessments. Hank worked closely with OSHA in forming 1910.147 in the mid-'80s. Mr. LaRocco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank everyone for attending. Hopefully in this session, we'll be able to answer any questions you may have and provide you with some information on 1910.147, the Hazardous Information Act, as we go along. So I will try to do this informally as possible, and at the end, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. What is lockout tagout? A little bit of history for you. It passed in 1989 after about 4 years of committee meetings, which is how they typically do it. I happen to be lucky enough to be on the manufacturers committee representing the manufacturers that would help companies comply with this type of regulation. And yes, I was about 12 years old at that time, so I started very young. But the way the process works, it goes through committees and it goes through manufacturers committees, and then the final law was passed in 1989. And basically what it does is it covers all servicing and maintenance of equipment and regarding energy and startup so that people can work on the equipment without being injured. It actually is one of the costliest ever OSHA regulations that's been passed over the years. And surprisingly, after almost 30 years, it has maintained its top 10 status in terms of violations each year for all of those years. So it is an important regulation to understand, and is one that pretty much applies to everyone in the manufacturing sector, MRO sector, that covers work, maintenance, and repair. Obviously, again, going after the starting in 1989, applies to pretty much 40 million workers. And over the 30 years, as I said, it's still really a relevant regulation and one which everyone needs to understand. Compliance steps, we went through the history a little bit. Fines are actually now, after all these years, fairly large. In the original 10 years of this regulation, for example, OSHA was a little bit lenient in terms of fines while everybody was getting the written programs together and all the information that you needed to write this program. So leniency was the norm back then. After this many years, we found in the field that the fines are substantial, and many attempts to appease them don't really last anymore. And as I said before, it's really still, I believe in 2017, it was number 5 on the OSHA top 10 list, if I remember correctly. So it still maintains its position as one of the most cited violations out there. I'll let you read these things a little bit and then talk about them. Compliance steps, these are the 3 most important things that you need to remember. And of those 3, probably the most important one is establishing a written program for your facility. And within that category, the most difficult part to do is writing machine-specific procedures. In other words, you can't just write a general program that specifies what you're going to do for lockout tagout. You actually must write individual machine-specific procedures for every piece of equipment that will go through and have to follow lockout tagout procedures. This is a very difficult step and probably the most time-consuming step of the 3 compliance steps. So that's an important one to remember. Energy sources. Another area of a little bit of concern. Everybody is aware of electrical as an energy source. What many people don't realize in the field, as you look through this list of energy sources, are the different types of energy sources that have to be accounted for when writing a lockout tagout procedure. Obvious ones are electrical and hydraulic, mechanical. Some of the less obvious ones are, for example, chemical, and even gravity. In other words, what happens if you turn off a switch, turn off a piece of equipment? Will something else fall in terms of gravity? This is the other types of things that you have to look through when you're writing a machine-specific procedure. Even things like springs, capacitors, these are areas of stored energy that have to be addressed. The formal six-step procedure. Again, I'll let you read this real quickly. This is the mandated 6 steps that you need to address when writing machine-specific procedures. From notifying and clearing all the affected employees all the way down through verifying energy isolation. In other words, actually trying out the machine or piece of equipment once everything has been installed on it in terms of energy isolating devices. The very end is also important, trying out. That is an important step because, for example, with valves and pipes, simply turning off a valve does not release the stored energy in a system. Same thing with a capacitor for electrical, which is why once you do apply your isolating devices that you need to go back and actually verify and try out the piece of equipment, bleed the valves, make sure everything is in an isolated state before you go ahead and proceed with the repair. Don't just turn things off. Exemptions. There are a number of exemptions, mainly for large industry, but really what it comes down to at the end, if you look at those 2 areas down at the bottom, the bullet points that are in red, these are the most important things that you need to ask yourself anytime that you have a question about lockout tagout. It doesn't have to matter even with exemptions, but anytime you wonder if you need to lock out or tag out, and that is whether you're required to remove or bypass a guard or other safety device to do whatever it is that you need to do. And the second question, main question is, do you have to put any type of body part into an area where it could be injured? These are the 2 most important things that you probably need to remember when you have questions about whether you actually need to file a lockout tagout. If the answer to either one of those is yes, then you do have to follow the lockout tagout procedures. Definitions, a little bit about who and what and where. Authorized person is actually the person who will perform the maintenance and service, and is typically the person who will apply the locks, the tags, the energy isolating equipment on the devices that need to be done. So he is an authorized employee, or she. An affected employee is typically, in most of the manufacturing plants I go to, an affected employee is a machine operator who may not be involved in the servicing of the equipment, but needs to be aware of what's going on with his piece of equipment in terms of lockout, tagout, what to recognize, the pieces of equipment he may see on the floor. Another type of affected employee may simply be an office worker, office employee that is passing through the area that needs to at least be aware of what tags are for, what they're designed for, and if he sees something, he needs to recognize what they're there for. Even a visitor, for example, that may be going through a plant needs to be made aware of what a lockout tagout is. Energy isolating device. This is actually where you're going to lock out the individual energy points, and these can be anything from a circuit breaker, disconnect, valve, a block. One of the questions that always comes up when I do these seminars, especially in the location, is are things like push buttons, selector switches, other control type switches are not energy isolating devices per the OSHA regulation. Switches can be bypassed. So you do need to go back either to a circuit breaker, bus bar, disconnect, a formal energy isolating cutoff, That's not to say that switches won't be part of a lockout procedure. In many cases, the on-off switches, a push button, the mushroom will also have a lockout device so that they cannot be turned on or pushed, but it should not be considered the main isolating point for your energy. Types of activities. Take a look at this. It'll give you some of the different applications where lockout tagout applies. And again, this falls back to the original two questions that I keep coming back to more and more again. Do you have to remove or bypass a guard to do whatever it is that you need to do, or do you have to put a body part into an area that can be injured? And that can apply in any one of these individual maintenance activities, but these are typically the ones that involve lockout tagout procedures being written for them. Energy control program, if you remember the 3 steps at the beginning that we gave you, an energy control program is actually part of 2 different things. You have to have a specific general program written for your facility, your company, however you do it, whether it's on a corporate basis, an individual plant, but a general program must be written that outlines the scope and the purpose and what the program is for as a general rule. The second part of that, if you remember correctly, is really the hardest part, which is writing the machine-specific procedures for the individual equipment. So again, there's 2 parts to the program. A general program outline that is put into the records for the company or the location, and then machine-specific programs which have to go into an individual procedure for your people. In other words, things like energy sources have to be identified, valves, switches, on, off, things you need to really just take a look at. For example, where to begin? How do you begin? Take a look at a piece of equipment and identify each piece of equipment that is used and what energy source is really servicing that piece of equipment. And typically this won't happen in a normal operation, but you're also required to include broken or stored equipment. In the real world, does that happen? Probably not. But the second most important part is really what do you need to lock out that piece of equipment? Is there more than one energy source that goes into that piece of equipment that you have to identify and how to lock out? One of the questions that typically comes up is plugged equipment. For example, a small drill press or a lathe, or even in an office environment, if you're working on a copy machine, for example, if the single source of energy into that piece of equipment is a plug, and that plug can be in the immediate area of the person doing the servicing, then you don't have to follow lockout procedures. If the plug, for example, is one of these that's maybe routed through a wall and into another room where you cannot physically bring the plug into the room with the servicing person, then you do have to follow lockout procedures. So again, you have to, if it's only a single energy source and you can bring it by you, you're okay. If not, then you do have to follow individual lockout tagout procedures. The key, again, to the whole program is personal protection. The reason this whole program was designed is to provide personal protection for the people doing the servicing. All the regulations, all the sentences, everything else underneath there really are relegated to secondary compared to the first one. It's really the most important thing when you're doing the servicing is that you have the sole personal protection and control of that piece of equipment. Nobody should ever be able to remove or bypass your lockout device. That's strictly forbidden without a detailed set of reasons which we can get into later. But specific for the lockout tagout, the devices must identify who's doing the procedure. The locks, if you're using locks, should only be used for lockout tagout procedures. They should not be used for things like toolboxes, lockers, anything else. They must identify the person doing the procedure so that it's understood, whether it's on the lock, whether it's on the tag. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference of locks and tags going forward, but it's important, again, the most important part is the personal protection of the person doing the servicing. Limitations, really only one. Lockout is the most appropriate means of ensuring that the equipment is locked out. However, if the device or the piece of equipment can't physically accept a lock, a tag may be used instead. As long as the tag identifies the person, the procedure being offered, there are restrictions on the tags themselves, which we'll talk about in a minute, but I will give you a personal idea that if you're using a tag alone in an area where you can use a lock, I definitely would not recommend that, because what will happen down the road is you must, in the case of an accident, you must demonstrate that the tag was as effective as a lock. And as it turns out, if you could have put a lock in there along with the tag, that makes it very hard to demonstrate. So my recommendation is, if it will take a lock, use a lock in the tag as opposed to just a tag. And again, tags have their limitations. They're actually limited in terms of how they're manufactured. They have to be able to take environmental conditions, a wet workplace, chemicals. One of the most important parts is the grommets. If there are grommets on your tag, must have a minimum of a 50-pound pull-out strength, so that it's not easy for the tag to be pulled out or removed. So there are restrictions on the tags as well if you're using them, but again, my recommendation would be, if you can use the lock along with the tag, that would be the preferred method. Annual inspections routinely should be done. There are many of them for the obvious reasons. New equipment being in place, new electrical circuiting, new personnel, new employees, changes in the floor layout, changes in the electrical layout. These are things that you have to go over every year in an annual inspection to make sure that the procedures written for certain pieces of equipment have not changed. And if they have, you need to rewrite the procedures and redo the training. That would also include employee reviews. Once in a year, you should make a review between the inspector and each one of the authorized employees. And the best way to do that, simple. Go through the procedure one step at a time and physically try it. See if it works. That's the easiest way. Tag out, again, same thing, a little bit more detailed, because under the procedure, if you're not using locks, it's a little bit more difficult to show that the procedure will be as safe as if you used a lock. Training programs should be done, again, at least once a year as a review. Certainly when you have new employees come in that need to go through the basic training. And in management, this should be part of permanent records that are taken with your employees. When I do training in the field, for example, at the end of the training, at the end of whether I use a video or strictly audio training, I typically will give a little certification test that the employee takes, hopefully passes. He will sign a date, and that will go into the employee's file, so that in the event of some type of an incident, if OSHA does come in and wants to see the training records, you have them. And that's an important part of the training, as well as obviously the employees need to know what's going on, how they need to go on. So that way you're covered all around. A little bit of a review. Authorized employee, a little bit more detailed of a training than typically an affected employee, an office employee, a visitor. But obviously, because the authorized employee is the one that's putting on the equipment, he will receive more training than anybody else in terms of understanding what he has to do, how he has to do it for a piece of equipment. So the authorized employee obviously is going to get the most. Affected, as I said before, typically these are machine operators. They may not be involved in a procedure, but they certainly must be aware of what's going on. Office employees, the same thing, at least walking through, if they see tags, if they see something in place that is not normal, they need to recognize what lockout devices are in place, or at least the procedures being used so they don't put themselves in an area where they can be injured. We talked about office, other types of people that may be in your plant, things like contractors, also have to be aware of what the equipment is that you're using, be identified what the procedures are, what to look for, and obviously they're not going to be able to start up or re-energize the lockout or tagged out equipment. Very important. Retraining, again, we did this a little bit before. If there's a change in an employee's job assignment, if equipment is changed, a change in the lockout tagout procedure, these must be done as needed there, but also conducted whenever a periodic inspection reveals that the employees really don't have a grasp of what they need to do. And typically this involves change in job status, change in equipment, something that's a little bit different than what's gone on in the past. And typically the supervisor will recognize this, go through the training periods that you need to do to identify the different pieces of equipment and how to follow the lockout tagout procedures. Group lockout. Probably most of you involved in that is where a number of people are required to perform service on a piece of equipment, typically a larger piece of equipment that may involve everybody from safety to maintenance to pipe fitters, with a large number of people trying to work on the same piece of equipment. And the trick with group lockout is that each one of those people have to have the same level of personal protection as each other. And there's a couple different ways of doing it. Depending on the number of people, you can use what we call a lockout hasp, which typically allows from 6 on up to, there's hasps out there that use as many as 24 locks. You've probably seen these in videos. It kind of looks like a Christmas tree on the piece of equipment. Many safety people don't like to do it this way because there's just too much stuff hanging out by the piece of equipment. And for that reason, what's used most commonly in the field is a group lockout box, where one person is responsible for the job and that all the other employees will put their keys in a group lockout box and cannot get at those keys until their portion of the work is done, and then the final release of the equipment is done by the person that's in charge of the entire lockout tagout procedure. So it's a very easy way to handle multiple people working on a single piece of equipment. Shifter personnel changes. Again, pretty straightforward as long as you maintain, if there are continuous shifts from, for example, first to second shift. If a piece of equipment is still locked out and is not ready to be energized or used and has to continue on, what needs to happen is the authorized personnel from first shift, for example, have to pass off to the second shift and let the second shift authorized personnel put their energy devices on the piece of equipment so that you maintain a state of de-energized through the procedure. Now, one thing, if you don't have 3 shifts in a facility, for example, and you need to maintain a lockout tagout procedure from the second shift to a first shift, what's typically used in the field is, we call it a blind set of locks. So usually on the end of the second shift, there's a set of locks available. They don't have keys in them, but they're open so that the second shift operator can take and replace his locks, put the blind set of locks on the piece of equipment so that they maintain the energized state. And then the authorized person on the first shift, he has the keys to those locks. so that he's able to get in and then replace the blind set of locks with his own. That way there's maintenance of hazardous energy through the shift that's not there. And that's usually the many case in many locations where there's not a third shift. Unusual conditions, take a look at that. There obviously are tons of unusual conditions that come up in the typical operations of a manufacturing plant. And I'll just go down to the most important thing again. If you're not sure, you must follow the basic requirements. And again, it goes back to removing or bypassing a guard, putting a body part in an area that could cause injury. Those are your fallback questions for what you need to do in any condition. Contractors, if you have contractors coming in on site to work on your electrical systems or pieces of equipment, it will depend on whether the contractor uses their own devices, in which case they must go through and inform all the affected employees of what their devices are, what they look like, how they'll be applied to whatever they're in to do the work for. So in other words, they'll use their equipment. They still have to follow the lockout procedures of the employee, of the employer. They will look at them and make sure that they're following the programs that are set forth by the employer. If a contractor does not have their own lockout devices, for example, which in my experience is probably at least half of outside contractors don't carry their own things with them, then they do have to follow the procedures and use the equipment of the employer and follow the same procedures that employees would be. Again, a review, a typical shutdown procedure. I'll let you look at them. It basically is a six-step procedure going through the 6 steps all over again. Just kind of a review of what we've talked about through the whole individual program. Most important part, again, verifying the isolation of energy has actually occurred, and that simply is by trying things, turning them on, making sure that nothing is energized. Removing is basically the opposite of the 6-step procedure, making sure that things are not laying around, tools, everything that you use to do the repairs is not in the area, and basically removing everything that you do in terms of the device, and then finally letting people know that you're actually going to turn the equipment back on, and then finally re-energizing the equipment to make sure it's working properly. After all of that, accidents still happen. I get involved with probably, in my area in the Midwest, probably 60 to 150 accidents per year. I won't go into some of the gruesome details, but I can tell you some of the accidents that happen are the most stupidest things you will ever see in your life. People cutting corners, people not understanding what to do in a certain procedure, but very rarely will it happen because someone didn't follow a detailed procedure. It'll just happen because somebody wants to cut some corners and do things fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Hank, very much for your presentation. I want to go ahead and just introduce myself. My name is Rebecca Avery. I am a digital merchandising manager at MSC, and I just want to thank Hank again and also thank National Marker Company for joining us in presenting this joint webinar on lockout tagout. Like Hank mentioned throughout his presentation, lockout tagout is one of those violations that you see over and over again, the OSHA Top 10 violations list year after year. So really want to thank Hank again for giving us this informative webinar. As a safety professional in the manufacturing industry, it's your job to ensure a safe, hazard-free work environment every day. To help with that, MSC has established our Better MRO site, which is a content site that features articles, infographics, videos, webinars such as these, all about all different types of information having to do with the safety industry. That website can be reached at mscdirect.com/BetterMRO. And a copy of this webinar, a recorded copy of this webinar, will actually be housed on Better MRO for any future Times you want to go back and watch it again, if you want to share with colleagues. I'll be sending out a thank you note along with this URL and a recording of the webinar as well. Again, thank you, Hank, for your time today. We can open up for Q&A.
And at this time, I would like to